The call for help. Elijah Harris tightened his grip on the grocery bag as he approached his apartment building. The weight of the bag was nothing compared to the heavy thoughts pressing on his mind. The loaf of bread and a few apples inside were all he could afford, but he knew his mother would appreciate the effort. She always told him that small gestures carried the greatest meaning. But today, he could feel something was off. The sky hung low with dark clouds, reflecting his mood. His sneakers scuffed against the cracked pavement as he reached the rusted iron door of the building. Something felt different. The neighborhood, usually filled with faint chatter and distant sounds of music, seemed eerily silent. It was the kind of silence that prickled at his nerves, warning him of something unseen. When he reached for the door, Elijah's heart sank. It was slightly ajar. His mother, no matter how tired or sick, always locked it. She had drilled the habit into him as well, especially in their neighborhood, where every sound could mean trouble. He hesitated. The pit in his stomach grew. Something was wrong. Pushing the door open, Elijah stepped inside and called out, "Mom." His voice echoed in the dim hallway. The silence that answered chilled him. He moved cautiously toward the kitchen, the usual smells of dinner absent. Instead, the acrid scent of something burning reached his nose. The sight of his mother sprawled on the kitchen floor froze him in place. Her dark skin was pale, her chest barely moving. Steam rose from a pot on the stove, the contents boiling over and sizzling against the burner. "Mom." Elijah's voice cracked as he dropped the grocery bag. Apples rolled across the floor, forgotten. He rushed to her side, kneeling and shaking her shoulder gently. "Wake up. Mom, please." Her breathing was shallow, her face clammy to the touch. Elijah's hands trembled as panic began to rise. He turned to the stove, quickly twisting the knob to turn off the heat. His mind raced. What should he do? How could he help her? Her cell phone. That's it. He scrambled to his feet, running to the bedroom they shared. The small space felt cavernous as he scanned frantically for the phone. He found it on the nightstand, plugged into the charger. Grabbing it, he darted back to the kitchen. His fingers fumbled as he dialed 911. The phone felt slippery in his sweaty grip. Each ring echoed painfully in his ears, stretching the seconds into eternity. 911. What's your emergency? The calm, detached voice on the other end felt almost mocking against the chaos in his chest. My mom. Elijah's words spilled out in a frantic rush. She's unconscious. She's pregnant. And she's not breathing right. Please, I need help. Okay, sweetie. I need you to tell me your address, the operator said, her tone unnervingly steady. 2312 Brownstone Avenue, apartment 204. Elijah practically shouted, his voice breaking. Please hurry. The operator paused, the sound of typing filling the silence. Elijah's heart raced as he awaited her response. 2312 Brownstone Avenue, she repeated, her tone flat. That's on the east side, correct? Yes, Elijah cried, the tears he'd been holding back threatening to spill. Please, my mom's pregnant. She needs help. The operator sighed audibly, her voice growing colder. Honey, I need you to understand something. Calls from that area take a while for our units to reach. We're spread thin, and we have to prioritize more urgent cases. Elijah's world stopped. Her words struck like a physical blow. Not urgent. She's not breathing right. He shouted, his voice trembling with desperation. Listen, sweetie, people from your area need to learn how to handle things themselves, the operator said dismissively. Before Elijah could protest, the line clicked. She had hung up. For a moment, Elijah just stared at the phone, his hands trembling. How could she do that? How could they leave his mom like this? His chest heaved as panic clawed at him. He wanted to scream, to cry, but he couldn't afford the luxury of breaking down. His mom needed him. Taking a deep breath, Elijah knelt back beside his mother. Okay, Mom, hold on, he whispered, forcing himself to think. He'd learned CPR in school, but practicing on a dummy wasn't the same as doing it for real. His heart pounded as he positioned his hands over her chest. "Come on, Mom," he said, his voice barely audible. "You can do this. Please don't leave me." He began compressions, his small arms shaking with the effort. He counted aloud, his voice trembling but determined. Between compressions, he tilted her head and blew air into her mouth, praying for any sign of improvement. "Please, please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The peeling paint on the walls and the flickering kitchen light blurred as he focused solely on her. Time felt like it stretched endlessly, each second a battle against despair. Then, faintly, he heard something. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the sound of sirens. His heart leaped. Help was coming. But his relief was short-lived. What if they were too late? What if his mom didn't make it? Elijah shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He couldn't let doubt take over. He had to keep going. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I love you. Please don't go." As the sirens grew louder, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't stop the compressions, refusing to give up. His hands ached, his arms burned, but he pushed through the pain. A knock at the door jolted him. It was sharp, urgent. "Elijah, open up," a voice called. It was Miss Rosa, the elderly woman from down the hall. Her voice carried a mix of concern and authority. Elijah hesitated, torn between answering the door and staying by his mother's side. Another knock came, more insistent. "Elijah." "I heard the sirens. What's going on?" He scrambled to his feet and ran to the door, yanking it open. Miss Rosa stood there, her floral robe billowing slightly in the hallway's draft. Behind her, a few other neighbors had gathered, their faces etched with worry. "It's my mom," Elijah said, his voice cracking. "She's not breathing right. I called 911, but they—" His throat tightened, and he couldn't finish. Miss Rosa didn't wait for an explanation. She pushed past him, moving toward the kitchen. The neighbors followed, their murmurs filling the apartment. "Don't you worry, boy," Miss Rosa said, kneeling beside his mother. "We'll take care of her. Your mama's tough." Elijah stood frozen as the once lonely apartment became a hive of activity. Miss Rosa barked orders, sending neighbors to fetch towels, water, and even a car in case the ambulance didn't arrive in time. For the first time, Elijah felt a flicker of something other than fear, hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could save her. A community mobilized. Miss Rose's commanding presence brought a rush of activity to the small, dimly lit apartment. Elijah watched in a daze as neighbors poured in, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and concern. The boy had never seen them like this. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a lifeline. Miss Rosa knelt beside Elijah's mother, her hand steady despite her age. She dabbed a damp towel against the unconscious woman's forehead, her sharp eyes darting back and forth between the mother and the boy. "Elijah," she said firmly, snapping him out of his haze. "I need you to stay with me now, all right? We're going to get her through this." Elijah nodded, the lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. His small hands fidgeted at his sides, unsure of where he fit in this storm of grown-ups taking charge. Yet Miss Rosa's unwavering presence anchored him, her strength a shield against the panic threatening to consume him. Across the room, Mr. Patel, the elderly man from the third floor, shuffled in with a small medical kit clutched in his hands. "I have a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "Good," Miss Rosa said without looking up. "Get her vitals now." As Mr. Patel crouched down, Miss Rosa turned to the crowd of neighbors gathering in the hallway. Her voice carried the authority of a general. "You, get more cold towels. And you, yes, you, run down and make sure that ambulance knows exactly where we are. We don't need them wasting time." The tattooed man she pointed to, Rawl, nodded and sprinted out the door. Moments later, the sound of his heavy boots echoed down the stairwell. Miss Rosa turned back to her task, muttering under her breath about incompetent 911 operators. Elijah hovered nearby, his gaze fixed on his mother's pale face. Her breathing was still faint, her chest rising and falling unevenly. He felt utterly helpless, his small hands itching to do something. Anything to help. "Miss Rosa," he said softly, his voice trembling. "What if the ambulance doesn't get here in time?" Miss Rosa paused, her hands still. She turned to him, her expression softening for the briefest moment. "We're not going to think like that, Elijah. Your mom is a fighter, and so are you. Just stay strong for her, okay?" Elijah nodded, his lips pressing into a tight line. He wanted to believe her, but the weight of fear sat heavy in his chest. Behind him, the apartment had become a whirlwind of movement. Someone had brought a basin of cold water, and another neighbor was gathering blankets. Raul returned, breathless but triumphant. "I flagged them down," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "They're coming up now." The word sent a surge of hope through the room. Elijah darted to the window, craning his neck to see the ambulance parked below. 2 paramedics were unloading equipment, their movements quick and practiced. "They're here," Elijah shouted, his voice breaking with relief. He turned back to the group, his eyes burning with tears. "They're really here." The door burst open moments later, and the paramedics strode in, their presence commanding immediate respect. One was a tall man with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor, while the other, a petite woman, carried herself with quiet intensity. They took in the scene with sharp eyes, their hands already moving to open their bags. "What happened?" the man asked, his voice steady as he knelt beside Elijah's mother. "She collapsed," Miss Rosa answered quickly. "She's pregnant, and her breathing's been shallow. We've tried to keep her cool and stable." The female paramedic nodded, slipping an oxygen mask over the woman's face. "Good job. Let's get her stabilized and transport her." Elijah watched, frozen in place, as the paramedics worked with swift precision. They spoke in a language of medical jargon he didn't understand, their hands moving with practiced ease. He wanted to believe everything would be okay, but the sight of his mother lying so still on the floor made it hard to breathe. Miss Rosa placed a firm hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "See? They'd got her now," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. "You did everything you could, Elijah. Don't forget that." For a moment, Elijah let himself lean into her touch, drawing strength from her unwavering presence. But then, as the paramedics prepared to lift his mother onto the stretcher, a new fear gripped him. "I want to go with her," he blurted out, stepping forward. "I have to go with her." The male paramedic glanced up, his expression softening. "We'll take good care of her, kid," he said. "But we'll need you to meet us at the hospital. There's not enough room in the ambulance." "No," Elijah said, his voice rising. "I can't. I need to be with her." Miss Rosa stepped in, her hand still firm on his shoulder. "Elijah," she said gently, "you need to trust them now. They're going to help her, and we'll follow right behind. You're not alone in this, all right." The boy hesitated, his chest heaving with the effort to hold back tears. Finally, he nodded, though his heart ached at the thought of letting her out of his sight. As the paramedics wheeled the stretcher toward the door, the neighbors parted to make way. The room fell silent except for the faint squeak of the wheels and the hum of the oxygen tank. Elijah followed them to the doorway, his eyes never leaving his mother. The tattooed man, Raul, stepped forward, his voice gruff but kind. "I'll drive you and Miss Rosa to the hospital," he said. "We'll be right behind them." Miss Rosa nodded, giving Elijah's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "See, we've got a plan. Let's go." The next moments blurred together as Elijah climbed into Raul's beat-up sedan, Miss Rosa sliding in beside him. The car smelled faintly of oil and old leather, but Elijah barely noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of his mother, of the ambulance speeding ahead, of the hospital waiting at the end of this desperate journey. As Raul navigated the narrow streets, Miss Rosa turned to Elijah, her sharp eyes soft with empathy. "You're stronger than you know, Elijah," she said. "Your mom's going to need that strength. And so will you. Just hold on a little longer." Elijah nodded, his hands clenching into fists in his lap. He didn't feel strong. He felt scared and small, a boy caught in a storm too big to handle. But Miss Rosa's words planted a seed of determination in his heart. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to see his mother smile again. A mother's strength. The hospital loomed ahead, a massive building with glowing windows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night sky. Raul's car screeched to a halt near the emergency entrance, and Elijah leaped out before the engine had fully stopped. Miss Rosa followed closely, her floral robe fluttering in the warm night air. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast a sterile glow over everything, making the atmosphere feel surreal. Nurses and doctors moved with purpose, their expressions a blend of focus and fatigue. Elijah's eyes darted around, searching desperately for the paramedics who had taken his mother. "This way, Elijah," Miss Rosa said, guiding him through the sliding doors. Her voice was steady, but her grip on his arm betrayed her own nervousness. "Let's find the desk and see where they've taken her." Elijah's heart pounded as they approached the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a headset perched on her head. "My mom," Elijah blurted out, his voice trembling. "She was just brought in. She's pregnant, and she wasn't breathing right." The receptionist typed quickly, her eyes scanning the screen. "Name: Melanie Harris," Miss Rosa supplied, stepping forward. "She came in just a few minutes ago." The receptionist nodded and pointed down a hallway. "She's in room 12. A doctor will be with her shortly. Only one of you can go back for now." Miss Rosa turned to Elijah, her face softening. "You go, Elijah. She needs to see you more than anyone." Elijah hesitated, glancing up at Miss Rosa. He didn't want to leave her, but he couldn't wait another second to see his mother. He nodded quickly and rushed down the hallway, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The room felt impossibly quiet when he stepped inside. His mother lay on a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped steadily. An oxygen mask covered her face, and an IV dripped fluid into her arm. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm, an improvement from earlier, but it did little to ease Elijah's fear. "Mom," he whispered, stepping closer. His voice cracked, and he clenched his fists to keep from crying. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked disoriented. Then her gaze settled on him, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Elijah," she murmured, her voice weak but filled with warmth. Relief washed over him like a tidal wave. He reached for her hand, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes. "I was so scared," he admitted, his words spilling out in a rush. The 911 operator didn't care. They weren't going to come, but Miss Rosa and everyone. They helped. They got you here. Melanie's eyes filled with tears, but she squeezed his hand weakly. "You're so brave," she said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Before Elijah could respond, the door opened, and a doctor walked in. She was a tall woman with sharp features and a calm demeanor, her white coat pristine. "I'm Dr. Alvarez," she said, glancing between them. "You must be Elijah." He nodded quickly, his heart racing. "Is my mom going to be okay?" Dr. Alvarez's expression softened. "Your mom is stable for now, but we're keeping a close eye on her. It looks like she was dehydrated, and her blood pressure dropped dangerously low. That's why she collapsed. The pregnancy is putting extra strain on her body." Elijah's stomach churned. "But she's going to be okay, right?" "We're doing everything we can," the doctor assured him. "She's a fighter, and she got here just in time. That's thanks to you." Elijah swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a scared kid who had almost lost his mom. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Dr. Alvarez crouched down so she was at eye level with him. Now we make sure she gets the care she needs. We'll monitor her overnight, and we may need to run some more tests to make sure the baby is okay too." Elijah glanced at his mother, who gave him a faint smile from behind the oxygen mask. "I'll be okay," she whispered. "You don't have to worry." But he did worry. He couldn't help it. He had seen how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. "Can I stay with her?" he asked the doctor, his voice small. Dr. Alvarez nodded. "Of course. You can stay as long as you need." Hours passed in a blur. Elijah sat in the chair beside his mother's bed, his head resting against the rail as exhaustion finally began to catch up with him. Nurses came and went, checking her vitals and adjusting her IV. He barely registered their movements, his focus entirely on his mother's steady breathing. At some point, Miss Rosa peeked into the room. "How is she?" she asked softly. "She's stable," Elijah said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "The doctor said she's going to be okay." Miss Rosa stepped inside, her eyes scanning the monitors. "That's good, Elijah. You did everything you could for her, more than most kids your age could handle." He shook his head. "I don't feel like I did enough. I couldn't even get 911 to come. They didn't care." Miss Rosa's expression hardened. "That operator was wrong, Elijah. They had no right to treat your call like it didn't matter. We'll deal with that later. For now, focus on your mom. She's here because of you." Elijah nodded, though the guilt still lingered. He couldn't shake the memory of the operator's cold dismissal, the way her words had made him feel invisible. But looking at his mother now, alive and recovering, he realized something important. He hadn't been invisible to the people who mattered. "Thank you," he said quietly, glancing up at Miss Rosa. "For helping. For everything." Miss Rosa's lips curved into a small smile. "That's what neighbors are for, Elijah. You're not alone in this." As the night wore on, Elijah stayed by his mother's side, his small hand wrapped around hers. The fear that had gripped him earlier was still there, but it had softened, replaced by a quiet determination. No matter what happened next, he wouldn't let her face it alone. Outside the room, the hospital hummed with life, a constant reminder that the world kept moving even in the face of tragedy. Elijah closed his eyes, the steady beeping of the monitors lulling him into a restless sleep. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to dream. Not of fear, but of hope. The ripple effect. The early morning sunlight crept into the hospital room, cutting through the sterile fluorescent lighting and casting soft golden hues over the walls. Elijah stirred in the chair beside his mother's bed, his body stiff from the uncomfortable position. His hand was still clutching hers, as if letting go might cause her to drift away. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking away the haze of sleep, and was immediately greeted by the sight of his mother's face, tired, but more vibrant than it had been the day before. "Good morning, sweetheart," Melanie said softly, her voice still weak but filled with warmth. Elijah's heart swelled with relief. "Mom," he said, sitting up straighter. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she admitted, her smile faint but genuine. "But better. Much better." Before Elijah could respond, the door opened and Dr. Alvarez stepped in. She held a clipboard and wore the same calm expression as the night before. "Good morning, Melanie," she said, her eyes flicking to Elijah. "And Elijah, I see you spent the night." "He wouldn't leave," Melanie said, her tone tinged with pride. "He's stubborn like that." Dr. Alvarez chuckled. "That stubbornness might have saved your life. How are you feeling this morning?" Melanie nodded. "Better, thanks to you all." The doctor's face grew serious. "You've been through a lot, Melanie. The dehydration and low blood pressure were dangerous for both you and the baby. We need to keep you under observation for another day or two to make sure everything stabilizes." Melanie nodded, her hand tightening around Elijah's. "Whatever it takes. I need to be here for my son and this baby." Dr. Alvarez's eyes softened. "That's the spirit. And I have some good news. The baby's vitals are strong. You've got a fighter in there." Elijah exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief coursed through him, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing thought that had plagued him all night. "Dr. Alvarez," he said hesitantly, "what happens when we go home? What if something like this happens again?" The doctor regarded him with a thoughtful expression. "That's a good question, Elijah. We'll be sending your mom home with a care plan, including follow-up visits and some medication to help manage her blood pressure." But she paused. "You're right to think ahead. Emergencies like this shouldn't be taken lightly. I'll make sure you have the resources you need." Elijah nodded, though the weight of responsibility felt heavy on his young shoulders. He wasn't sure what kind of resources would be enough to ease his worries. Later that morning, as Melanie dozed off, Elijah stepped out of the room to stretch his legs. The hospital hallway was bustling with activity. Nurses wheeling carts, doctors flipping through charts, patients being escorted to their rooms. It was a world of urgency and purpose, and yet Elijah felt oddly disconnected from it all. He wandered to the waiting area, where he found Miss Rosa sitting in a corner chair with a styrofoam cup of coffee in her hands. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a smile. "There's my hero," she said, patting the seat beside her. Elijah sank into the chair, his legs dangling a few inches above the floor. "She's doing better," he said. "Dr. Alvarez said the baby's okay too." Miss Rosa nodded, her smile deepening. "See, your mama's tough. She's not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a moment before Elijah spoke again, his voice small. "Miss Rosa, why didn't the 911 operator care? Why didn't she send help right away?" The older woman's expression darkened, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Some people think they can decide who deserves help and who doesn't," she said. "They judge by where you live, what you look like, how much money they think you have. It's not right." Elijah frowned. "But how can they do that? It's their job to help people." Miss Rosa sighed. "It is, but not everyone takes their job seriously, and sometimes it takes people like us to remind them what they're supposed to be doing." Her words stuck with Elijah as they made their way back to his mother's room. The idea that someone could dismiss a life-or-death situation simply because of where they lived filled him with a mix of anger and determination. He didn't know what he could do about it, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let it happen again. Not to his mom. Not to anyone. By the afternoon, word had spread about Elijah's experience. Miss Rosa, never one to keep quiet about injustice, had already begun rallying the neighbors. As Elijah sat by his mother's bed, he overheard her speaking animatedly on the phone just outside the room. "It's unacceptable, plain and simple," she said, her voice rising. "That boy called for help, and they left him hanging. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. Yes, I'm serious. A meeting. Tonight." When she returned to the room, Elijah looked at her curiously. "What meeting?" Miss Rosa grinned. "A community meeting. We're going to talk about what happened and figure out how to make sure the 911 service takes us seriously." Elijah tilted his head. "But how can we do that?" "By sticking together," Miss Rosa said firmly. "When people see a united front, they can't ignore us. It's time to remind them that we're more than just a dot on a map." That evening, while Melanie rested, Elijah and Miss Rosa joined a growing crowd of neighbors in the community center. The room buzzed with energy as people shared their own stories of being dismissed or ignored by emergency services. Some were angry, others resigned, but all were determined to make a change. Miss Rosa stood at the front of the room, her voice carrying over the din. "What happened to Elijah and Melanie should never happen again," she said. "We pay taxes just like everyone else. We have the right to be treated with dignity and respect." Elijah watched as the crowd nodded in agreement, their faces set with resolve. For the first time, he felt the full strength of his community. The same people who had rushed to his aid the night before, now standing together to demand better. By the end of the meeting, plans were in motion. A petition was drafted, phone calls to local officials were scheduled, and a list of grievances was compiled. Elijah didn't understand all the details, but he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things could change. As he walked back to the hospital with Miss Rosa, he glanced up at her. "Do you think they'll listen?" "They will," she said confidently, "because we won't give them a choice." Elijah thought about his mother, resting in her hospital bed, and the baby growing inside her. He thought about the fear he had felt when he thought he might lose her, and the relief when help finally came. He didn't want anyone else to go through what they had. "I want to help," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes." Miss Rosa smiled down at him, her eyes glistening with pride. "That's the spirit, Elijah. Together, we can make sure no one gets left behind." As they reached the hospital, Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't just a scared kid anymore. He was part of something bigger, a community united by love, resilience, and the determination to fight for what was right. And that, he realized, was a strength no one could ignore. The awakening. The next day began with a warm glow filtering through the hospital blinds, casting soft patterns on the walls. Elijah hadn't left his mother's side since she had been admitted. He sat curled up in the chair by her bed, his head resting on his folded arms against the mattress. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, a comforting reminder that his mother was alive. Melanie stirred, her fingers twitching slightly. Elijah's eyes fluttered open, catching the movement. "Mom," he whispered, sitting upright. Her eyelids slowly opened, her gaze finding his. "Hey, baby," she murmured, her voice still weak but steadier than the day before. Tears welled in Elijah's eyes. He leaned forward, his small hands wrapping around hers. "You scared me so much," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know what to do." Melanie's smile was faint but full of love. "You did everything, Elijah. You saved me." Before he could respond, the door opened and Dr. Alvarez stepped in, her clipboard in hand. "Good morning," she greeted them warmly. "I see we're looking much better today." Melanie nodded, shifting slightly in bed. "Thanks to my son," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "And everyone else who helped." Dr. Alvarez smiled. "You've got quite a fighter in your corner," she said, glancing at Elijah. "Now let's talk about next steps. Melanie, we're going to keep you here one more night for observation, just to be safe. Your blood pressure is still a concern, and we want to ensure the baby is stable." Melanie nodded, her hand tightening around Elijah's. "Whatever it takes. I can't afford to take any risks." The doctor turned to Elijah. "And for you, young man, I recommend some rest. You've been through a lot." Elijah shook his head. "I'm fine. I just want to stay with my mom." Dr. Alvarez chuckled softly. "Well, it's clear where you get your determination from," she said, scribbling a note on her clipboard before leaving the room. As the door closed, Melanie turned to her son. "You should take a break, Elijah. Go for a walk or something. You've been cooped up in here too long." Elijah hesitated. The thought of leaving her side, even for a moment, felt wrong. But the look in her eyes, a mix of concern and encouragement, convinced him. "Okay," he said reluctantly, "but I'll come right back." Elijah wandered through the hospital corridors, his sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floors. The sterile smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, a constant reminder of where he was. He eventually found his way to a small outdoor courtyard, a hidden oasis surrounded by tall hospital walls. The courtyard was quiet, with only a few benches and a scattering of trees offering shade. Elijah sat down on one of the benches, his thoughts racing. The events of the past 2 days felt like a blur. His mother collapsing, the 911 operator's dismissal, the neighbors rallying to help, and the terrifying wait for the ambulance. It was all too much for a boy his age to process. "Mind if I join you?" A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Elijah looked up to see Miss Rosa, her ever-present floral scarf tied neatly around her head. She held 2 styrofoam cups, offering one to him. He took the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping into his cold hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. Miss Rosa sat beside him, her sharp eyes studying his face. "What's on your mind, kid?" Elijah shrugged, staring into the steaming liquid. "Everything. It's just a lot." Miss Rosa nodded, her expression softening. "It is a lot, but you handled it better than most grown folks would have." "I don't feel like I handled it," he admitted. "I just reacted." "That's what being strong is, Elijah," she said gently. "You acted when it mattered most. You didn't freeze up. You didn't give up. That's what saved your mama." Elijah didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ripples forming in his cup. After a moment, he looked up at Miss Rosa. "Why didn't the 911 operator care? What if they don't come fast enough next time?" Miss Rosa's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Because some people think it's okay to ignore us," she said, her voice low but firm. "They look at where we live, who we are, and they decide we're not worth their time." "That's not fair," Elijah said, his voice rising with emotion. "My mom could have died." Miss Rosa placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. "You're right. It's not fair. And that's why we're going to do something about it." Elijah tilted his head, confusion knitting his brows. "What do you mean?" "We've already started," Miss Rosa said, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Last night, we held a meeting at the community center. Folks shared their stories, times when they were ignored, just like you and your mama were. We're writing letters, making calls, and demanding better from the people who are supposed to protect us." Elijah felt a flicker of hope. "Do you think they'll listen?" "They'll have to," Miss Rosa said firmly, "because we won't stop until they do." That evening, Elijah returned to his mother's room with a renewed sense of purpose. Melanie was sitting up in bed, her color returning and her eyes bright with relief. "There's my boy," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. Elijah climbed into the chair beside her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Miss Rosa told me about the meeting," he said. "Everyone's working to make sure what happened to us doesn't happen again." Melanie's eyes glistened with tears, but her smile never wavered. "That's the kind of community we have, Elijah. When one of us falls, the rest of us pick them up. It's how we survive." Elijah nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. For the first time, he truly understood the strength of the people around him. They weren't just neighbors. They were a family bound by shared struggles and an unyielding determination to fight for each other. As the room fell quiet, Melanie reached out and took Elijah's hand. "You've grown so much these past few days," she said softly. "I always knew you were brave, but now I see just how strong you are." Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. "I had to be," he said. "For you. For the baby." Melanie squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "And you saved us, Elijah. Never forget that." The boy sat back in his chair, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the hospital's heater. For the first time, he felt not just relief, but a sense of empowerment. He wasn't just a scared kid anymore. He was part of something bigger, a family, a community, and a fight for change that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. A stand for change. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the community center as neighbors streamed through the doors. Elijah stood in the corner beside Miss Rosa, clutching a clipboard she'd handed him earlier. He watched in awe as the room filled with faces he recognized from his building and beyond. People he'd seen in passing, but never truly known. Tonight, they weren't just neighbors, they were allies. "Take a good look, Elijah," Miss Rosa said, her voice tinged with pride. "This is what happens when people care enough to stand up. Everyone here wants to make sure no one else gets ignored like you and your mama were." Elijah nodded, his grip on the clipboard tightening. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Rosa gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You help them understand why we're here. Speak from your heart, Elijah. people listen when you're honest." The boy swallowed hard, his nerves bubbling to the surface. Public speaking wasn't something he'd ever done. But the thought of his mother lying unconscious on the floor, the 911 operator's dismissive tone, and the overwhelming fear of losing her gave him courage. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for every person in the room who had ever felt invisible. The meeting began with Miss Rosa taking the stage. Her presence was magnetic, her voice carrying authority, as she laid out the night's agenda. "We're here tonight because something needs to change," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Too many of us have been ignored when we needed help the most. That ends today." Applause erupted, and Elijah felt a spark of pride. He wasn't alone in this fight. One by one, people came forward to share their stories. There was Mrs. Patel, who spoke about waiting over an hour for an ambulance when her husband had a stroke. Raul talked about calling 911 after a fight broke out on the street, only for the police to never arrive. Each story was met with nods of understanding and murmurs of agreement. When Miss Rosa called Elijah's name, his heart skipped a beat. He stood frozen for a moment, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. But then he saw his mother sitting in the front row, her face glowing with pride, despite her still recovering condition. That was all he needed. Elijah stepped onto the small stage, the clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. He looked out at the crowd, a sea of expectant faces, and took a deep breath. "Hi, I'm Elijah," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm here because I don't want anyone to feel the way I did." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 2 nights ago, my mom collapsed in our kitchen. She wasn't breathing right, and I didn't know what to do. I called 911, and they told me they'd send help when they could, but they didn't come right away because of where we live. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing on everyone. Elijah's voice grew steadier as he continued. "I was scared. No, I was terrified. I thought I was going to lose her. If it wasn't for Miss Rosa and the neighbors helping, I don't know what would have happened." He glanced down at the clipboard, where he'd scribbled a few notes. "We're here tonight to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. We deserve to be treated like we matter because we do." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. Elijah's chest swelled with pride as he stepped off the stage. Miss Rosa gave him a tight hug, whispering, "You did good, kid. Real good." As the meeting continued, plans were solidified. A petition demanding equal treatment from emergency services was drafted, and volunteers stepped up to collect signatures. Others pledged to write letters to city officials and attend council meetings to ensure their voices were heard. Elijah found himself at the center of it all, helping distribute flyers and handing out pens for people to sign the petition. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. It was empowering, and it filled him with a sense of purpose he'd never felt before. Later that night, as the meeting wound down, Elijah and his mother walked home together, the cool night air brushing against their faces. Melanie was still weak, her steps slower than usual, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I'm proud of you, Elijah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You stood up for what's right. That takes courage." Elijah glanced up at her, his face serious. "I just didn't want anyone else to feel the way we did," he said. "It's not fair." "No, it's not," Melanie agreed. "But because of you, things might change. And even if they don't right away, you've planted a seed. That's how change starts, with one brave step." As they reached their apartment building, Elijah paused, looking up at the familiar rusted door. It no longer felt ominous or threatening. Instead, it felt like a symbol of resilience, a reminder of how far they'd come in just a few days. Inside, Miss Rosa was waiting by her door, her arms crossed and a satisfied smile on her face. "You too make it back okay?" she asked. Melanie nodded. "Thanks to you, Miss Rosa. We wouldn't be here without you." Miss Rosa waved her hand dismissively, though her eyes glistened with emotion. You don't have to thank me. This is what neighbors do. Now get some rest, both of you. We've got a long road ahead." That night, as Elijah lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the hope. It all swirled together in his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop fighting. Not for his mom, not for his neighbors, and not for the community that had rallied around him when he needed them most. For the first time in days, he fell asleep with a smile on his face, dreaming not of fear, but of a brighter future, a future he was determined to help create, a legacy of hope. The days following the community meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Elijah had never seen his neighborhood so alive with purpose. The once muted streets now buzzed with determination as residents knocked on doors, gathered signatures, and distributed flyers. Everyone had a role, from the elderly offering advice and moral support to the younger generation walking block after block to spread the word. Elijah, too, found himself at the center of this movement. His story, retold by Miss Rosa and the neighbors, had become the rallying cry for change. People were no longer just talking about what had happened. They were doing something about it. The first breakthrough came a week later. Elijah was sitting at the kitchen table with his mother, helping her with small tasks to keep her occupied while she recovered. He had just handed her a cup of tea when Miss Rosa burst through the door, her floral scarf flapping behind her like a banner. "They responded," she exclaimed, holding up a letter with city council stationery. Melanie, still pale but improving, sat up straighter in her chair. "What does it say?" Miss Rosa adjusted her glasses, her hands trembling with excitement. "It says they've received the petition and the letters, and they want to hold a public hearing to address our concerns." Elijah's heart leaped. "A hearing? Does that mean they'll listen to us?" Miss Rosa nodded, her eyes shining. "That's exactly what it means. They can't ignore us now." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving the neighborhood little time to prepare. But Miss Rosa, ever the strategist, wasted no time rallying the troops. Meetings were held daily at the community center, where they rehearsed speeches, collected data, and organized transportation to ensure everyone who wanted to attend could be there. Elijah was nervous but excited. He was one of the people selected to speak at the hearing, a role that filled him with equal parts pride and fear. His mother, though still recovering, insisted on attending as well. The day of the hearing dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that felt ripe with possibility. Elijah dressed in his best clothes, his only button-up shirt, and a pair of slacks that were slightly too short. Melanie, despite her lingering fatigue, wore a simple dress and a determined expression. Miss Rosa, as always, looked regal in her floral print. The city council chamber was intimidating. Rows of polished wooden benches faced a long table where council members sat, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Elijah glanced around and saw that the room was filled with his neighbors, their faces resolute as they filed into the benches. Miss Rosa leaned down to Elijah as they waited for the hearing to start. "Remember, speak from your heart," she said. "You've lived this. No one can tell your story better than you." Elijah nodded, his hands gripping the edges of his prepared speech. He didn't need the paper, though. Every word was etched into his mind. When it was his turn to speak, Elijah stood, his legs trembling as he approached the microphone. The room fell silent, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, glancing at his mother in the front row. Her smile gave him the strength he needed. "My name is Elijah Harris," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm here because 2 weeks ago, my mom collapsed in our kitchen. She wasn't breathing right, and I didn't know what to do. I called 911, and the operator told me they'd send help when they could, but they didn't come right away." The council members leaned forward, their expressions softening as he spoke. Elijah continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They said it wasn't urgent because of where we live, but my mom could have died. She's pregnant, and I was scared I'd lose her and my baby brother or sister. No one should ever feel that way, not because of where they live, or how much money they have, or what they look like. He paused, looking directly at the council members. We deserve to be treated like we matter, because we do. My mom matters. My neighbors matter. And I'm asking you to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. Elijah stepped back from the microphone, his chest heaving with the effort of holding back tears. He felt his mother's arms around him as he returned to his seat, her voice soft in his ear. You were incredible. The hearing lasted hours, with testimony after testimony painting a vivid picture of neglect and injustice. By the end of the day, the council members were visibly moved, some even wiping away tears. They promised to investigate the emergency response system and make changes to ensure every call was treated with urgency, regardless of the caller's zip code. The neighborhood left the chamber that evening feeling victorious, though they knew the fight wasn't over. Real change would take time, but this was a step in the right direction. Weeks turned into months, and slowly progress became visible. New policies were implemented, requiring operators to prioritize all emergency calls equally. Response times improved, and additional resources were allocated to underserved areas. The community, once overlooked and undervalued, began to see the fruits of their collective effort. Elijah became something of a local hero, his story inspiring others to speak out and stand up for what they believed in. But to him, the real heroes were his mother, Miss Rosa, and the neighbors who had shown him what it meant to be part of a community. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Elijah sat on the stoop of his apartment building, watching the world go by. His mother joined him, her hand resting on her growing belly. She looked healthier than she had in months, her strength returning day by day. You've done so much, Elijah, she said, her voice full of pride. You've changed things. For us. For everyone. Elijah shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. I just did what I had to. Melanie tilted her head, her eyes glistening. You did more than that. You showed everyone that even the smallest voice can make a difference. Elijah looked out at the street, where kids played and neighbors greeted each other warmly. He thought about how far they had come, how much they had achieved together. The fear and helplessness he had felt that night in the kitchen were still a part of him, but they no longer defined him. He turned to his mother, his smile growing. We all did it, he said, together. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace. He didn't know what challenges the future would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. As long as they stood together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome.